Hi, everybody. We'll be starting in a few minutes. I think people are still eating. Come closer. You're too far. Now you look like a crowd and not like two people sitting here and there. No, I see. Okay. Come join us. Sit closer. So hi, everybody. I'm Marina Segal, and I'm heading the Cloud, SecOps, and Compliance at Checkpoint. And our session for today is about security posture. And hopefully, after the session, you would know whether your security posture is in a good shape. So a little bit about myself. I started my career not such a long time ago, but it was a pretty long time ago. I started at Deloitte. I was leading the compliance assessment, big compliance assessment project. And back in the days, that was a pretty boring job. A lot of companies were doing compliance in a very manual way. And hopefully that today the session would explain you, not in a very boring way, how we can manage compliance in the cloud environments. So to make it a little bit more interesting and entertaining, I took some inspiration from my kids. So for those of you who have kids, you probably know that it takes a lot of hard work to entertain them, especially when in my house we don't show screens to the kids during the work week. So the only thing that keeps them entertained for longer than 15 minutes is Legos. So since our session for today is 1 hour, I used a lot of Lego pictures, so hopefully you will not be bored. My accent is from different places, and if you are wondering what I'm doing in my free time, I'm leading WUSEC Bay Area, so if you want to open a new chapter in any place in Asia, let me know. So our agenda for today. We will be talking about cloud journey and what happens today, how the compliance was managed back in the old days, and what is different today. Why is it now we need to do something differently? Some worrying signs of the industry, and we'll connect that to the posture management with a lot of demos. So cloud journey. A lot of us are moving our workloads from the on-premises to the cloud, and as part of this journey, we're doing different things. We are lifting and shifting, we use containers, we use serverless architectures, and it's important to protect this journey irrespective of where you are on the scale, whether you use both containers and you have deployments on-prem, and you need to protect different pillars of your deployment. You need to protect your workloads, configurations, your identity, how your users are connecting to your environment. You need to protect your network, obviously. And in order to do that, you need to identify all of those assets that you're protecting. You need to make sure that you know what you're protecting. You need to put the right tools and processes in order to make your protection aligned with those different deployment types. You need to know how to respond to the incidents, and you also need to satisfy your auditors and compliance people. So back in the old days, how the compliance was managed back in the old days. And when I look back at the years that I've spent with Deloitte doing a lot of assessments and compliances for different companies, I remember that this process was terrible. We had a lot of different files, spreadsheets, PDF files, laws, and this compliance team of superheroes were spending their days mostly reading those requirements, trying to make sense out of them, because some of the requirements were written by lawyers, some of the requirements were written by compliance people, and some of the requirements were written by engineers. They needed to make sense out of all of those requirements and then go to the management to get the budgets, go to the security teams, explain them how those requirements make sense to them, work with business departments and make sure that they are on board and implement those controls, and also work with auditors to ensure that auditors are on board with how the implementation was done. So my day in the office, as part of each compliance assessment, one of the important controls that you needed to check is to visit data center. And that was the fun part. We were going to different data centers and trying to check all of the controls, making sure that our servers are protected. That's how my day looked like back then. We went to each one of the servers and tried to make sure that it is protected. We tried to make sure that the sprinklers are there, that no one can break into our servers, and that was not fun. Password settings, another popular control that we were trying to address, was about making sure that all of the password settings on all of your most sensitive applications or servers follow the right compliance requirements of complexity. We took a lot of screenshots. We needed to document those screenshots, and there were like dozens of different screenshots to document. And then we went back to the office the next day, and we tried to make sure that we don't mess settings of one server with another. So this is the typical compliance process. It's pretty manual, pretty ad hoc, it's reactive, no automation was in place. Now, I claim that in the cloud it's different, and I think that the posture management is the new compliance. We'll play a little game here, so try to memorize, without taking picture, this sentence. We'll get back to it. So compliance today is a moving target. And by moving target, I mean that we are moving our crown jewels to the cloud from the data centers. There are many moving pieces, and the environment is changing. We already talked a little bit about it, and the definition of workloads is changing. As we move from the on-prem to the cloud, we use different types of deployments. We use IaaS deployments, and they are constantly changing. We have new perimeters that we were not aware of before. We have a lot of blind spots. New instances come up and down every day. We have new buckets that are being deployed all the time, and we need to protect it. Containers, serverless architectures bring even more complexity to the job of compliance professionals, and basically everything today is a code. We have containers that look like a piece of code. We have serverless functions. There are no servers. All the deployments that we are using in this new world are ephemeral and interconnected. And our developers, they are very agile. They want to make constant changes without being stopped. Now, to add to that, cloud providers are also introducing a lot of changes. I tried to search and get a screenshot of how many services AWS provided back in 2014. And it was less than 30. I was able to fit it in on one screenshot. And I compared it to what is happening today, and basically I was only able to grab one screenshot of one category of services. The number of services that AWS provides today is over 140. This number is growing. I probably need to update this slide every day. So the visibility is very limited. We don't know what we protect at every moment of time. So the compliance in the cloud is actually a moving target. Developers run fast. Cloud providers making changes every day. The definition of workloads is changing, and we don't have visibility into anything that is happening in the cloud environments. So are you worried? Because I think we should be. Based on some analysis that I've done, I looked at the Gartner and what they are saying about cloud security. And there are some warning signs here. Through 2025, 90% of the organizations will fail and inappropriately share their sensitive data. Through 2024, majority of enterprises will continue to struggle to measure their cloud risks. And the last one, that is my favorite one, is that 99% of cloud security failures will be a customer's fault. This number was 95 just a year ago. Another warning sign is PCI. PCI been there since mid-2000, I guess 2007 is when it was introduced. And the PCI compliance is on decline for the first time since 2012. I would assume that it should become commodity by now. We're all supposed to know how to encrypt our credit card information. But we are seeing that the companies are still struggling to protect their environments, and the compliance score has failed over 10% in the last few years. Another worrying sign to me was that the typical week of professionals in compliance still looks like back in the old days. They are spending time on a lot of manual tasks. They're still mapping and tracking all of those regulatory requirements, and there is nothing. I went through each one of the lines here on the screen. There is no automation. And I don't understand how are we planning to protect the cloud environments and make sure that the compliance is in place if we don't use automation. So we all know that the security is shared responsibility and that the cloud provider is responsible for the security of the cloud. Physical security is on them. The different virtualization platforms protection is on them. But I think that the most work is on clients, on the customers of the public cloud. We have to be in charge of all of those different domains of security, starting with identity and access management, network security, logging, monitoring. All of those controls are on us to implement and make sure that they are in place when we move our assets and crown jewels to the cloud. So how can we stay compliant and protected? This is actually one of my favorite minifigures in my house. We need to implement solutions that help us with different flavors of posture management in the cloud. We need to do a lot of things to make sure that misconfigurations are not happening to us. Starting with posture management and compliance, understanding cloud inventories, what are we protecting, and visualizing it in order to know what is exposed, where is it located, where is our most sensitive data sitting. Making sure that we can auto-remediate any misconfiguration as it happens as soon as possible. Putting protection around our network and identities is very important for the proper posture management. And making sure that our network security is aligned with how we want our environment to be interconnected, inside and outside the deployments. Connecting it to threat intel processes to make sure that once the incident happens, we improve our security posture, and once we detect some misconfiguration, the threat intel team knows that something was misconfigured and that the risk goes up. So what can happen if we don't look after our posture and we are not paying attention? One of the examples that most of the presentations will cover was around the financial institution breach. 106 million of records got exposed. There are some presentation I saw that say 100 million, but the idea is the same. Customers' fault was that the misconfiguration, one of the problems there was that the misconfiguration of the EC2 instance that exposed data enabled unlimited access to its S3 bucket. What if the company would identify that there is an over-permissive role before that, then the attacker got into the system? They would be able to limit this access. With DOM9, part of the CloudGuard family, you are able to run the check that would simply identify all of those roles that overexpose your permissions to something that is not limiting it as needed. Once the issue identified, the CloudBot can be triggered and auto-remediate this issue. Another incident that happened a few years back was at Uber when there were credentials that were just posted on the GitHub. And that's basically like putting a sticky note on your laptop with password exposed. What if you would be able to scan the code, identify those credentials, and make sure that your developers use proper key management tools in order to protect those credentials? With our newest addition to the CloudGuard family, we are able to identify misconfigurations like that. We are able to tell you where in your Lambda each line has exposed credential. We talked about containers a little bit. Companies use containers to be more agile, to scale, but it also brings a lot of new risks and exposes us to new attack vectors. With the vulnerability that was introduced in the late 2019, attacker would be able to send malicious YAMLs or JSON payloads into my API server. An API server is a very important component of the container, which needs to be properly configured and protected. Once the YAML or JSON would get into the payload, it would cause basically the container to crash. And that would take my service down. Now, what if we could have looked at the configuration of this container and find that instead of true, we have false enabled? With CloudGuard DOM9 today, we are able to identify misconfigurations like that and notify you about them. And you can leverage this to run on an ongoing basis. So, posture management, and how does that relate to compliance? Does anyone remember the memory game we had before? Yes? Yes. Yes. Good. So, he took a picture, I saw. So, what does posture management mean? And I was told to call it advanced posture management. So, let's talk about advanced posture management. We have different steps in the process, and basically the methodology is similar to what compliance professionals were doing back in the old days in the data centers, but now we have a lot of new technologies that can help us to do it a little bit better. First, we start with visibility. We need to gain visibility into all of our deployments across the cloud, data center, serverless, containers, and it's better to understand what we are protecting using visualization, because we are humans. If we see a picture, we understand better what's going on. Inventories, we need to know what assets are sensitive and how we can drill down and understand a little bit more about each one of our inventories and understand where the exposures are. The next step of the posture management is scoping. We need to know what is in scope for my posture management program or compliance assessment. So if I hold credit card information just in one of my data centers or just in one of my cloud deployments, I don't need to do PCI on everything. I just need to scope it to that deployment that is relevant for the scope of my assessment. So understanding what are the assets in scope, which frameworks we need to be using, because in a big company that has a lot of different businesses, there might be over dozens of different regulatory and compliance requirements, and you don't want to manage all of them in silos. You need to connect it into one framework. Integrate that into CI/CD pipeline. How can you make sure that your developers scan their posture before deployment? Once you got through those steps, you would get to the first assessment. You will evaluate your results, customize it to your needs, and schedule it to run on an ongoing basis. So let's look at a few demos that can show you how CloudGuard family products can help you with each one of them. So it's a demo time. So visibility. Let's see how we can get visualization and understanding of our inventories with CloudGuard DOM 9. Okay. So Clarity module in DOM 9 helps you to view all of the security groups in your VPC. So we are getting into the Oregon security VPC, and we can see all of the peered connections, the inventories, and open it in a more clear view of all of the assets and how they connect to each other. So the closer we are to the red zone, the more exposed we are to the public internet. Basically, if you have sensitive assets or databases, we would expect them to be in the green zone. Once you move closer to the red zone, you're exposing yourself to more risk. Now, each block is a security group, and in this security group, we connect all of the assets according to their relations and show you what's under each one of the security groups. Now you can see what instances are connected to it, what are the inbound routing rules, and lines represent the connections. We can also get into more detailed view of security group and see all the information we have about the ruling, about the inbound rules, outbound rules, history of the changes, and we can also protect it with DOM 9 to make sure that your developers cannot make changes directly in on the cloud provider side. And every single change that's made on the cloud provider side would be reverted automatically by DOM 9. The next step is scoping. Now, as we understood how our environment looks like and what is exposed, we need to scope the assessment. We need to select which frameworks are relevant to us. And as we saw when back in the old days, we were doing all of those mappings, going through different files, this exercise is very manual. So if you have a lot of frameworks, what I suggest is to map them on the scale, starting from the most prescriptive one and going back to the most descriptive one. And you should start here because, for example, CIS benchmark gives you a very clear explanation for each one of the controls that you need to implement. It will tell you exactly how your MFA settings, multi-factor authentication settings, need to look like on AWS, on Google or Azure. Once you've implemented this configuration, you can address all the controls of ISO, HIPAA, or GDPR that talk about authentication. GDPR would tell you something like, make sure you use proper authentication mechanisms. And it is exactly the same as the control that CIS benchmarks provide, just telling you the exact implementation side. Now, when you want to evaluate is also an important question to ask. Do you want to be as close as possible to where your developers are? Do you want to make sure that your environment is in compliance or has a proper posture management techniques deployed before it's being deployed to production, or you're coming after the fact? And it really depends on the culture of the company. We've seen a lot of clients who would prefer to be here because they don't want their developers to be running and then fixing things, which is, I believe, the most efficient way to do it. But there are companies that don't want to mess up with the production. They are afraid, and they would be in the monitoring phases here on the right-hand side. Now, once we evaluated and defined the scoping, we understand what assets we are protecting. We know which compliance framework relates to us. We would start with evaluation of the results. So let's see a quick demo on how we can evaluate that in a few seconds without going to the data centers or getting captures of the screenshots of password settings. So we will select a framework on Azure, open that in DOM 9. There are many rule sets that relate to that, and we will select the NIST 853. There are many controls here that we can evaluate automatically. Now, we can run the assessment on a specific account in Azure and get results. Now, once we are getting the results, we have the high-level overview of our score and the summary, and we can get into more details. Look at each and every finding, evaluate that, and decide what is the next step. Now, what about containers? We talked about containers. So, hold on. Yep. We can, since a few months ago, we are able to perform the same assessment on your container. And your container can be on-prem or container that is sitting in the cloud environment. So let's see how it works. So we would look at our Kubernetes clusters that were onboarded to the CloudGuard DOM 9. Here is one of the clusters, for example, with all the settings. And now we will go and check perform the assessment on this cluster. CIS benchmark, as we saw, most prescriptive one, allows you to select this rule set, and same as we did with Azure NIST framework, run this assessment on your Kubernetes cluster. Again, we are getting the results in a few seconds. And here is your posture management on the container. Now, once you evaluated the results, same as we saw before, we can get into details. And the next step for us would be remediation or applying exclusions. So if we want to exclude finding because it has some other mitigation or it's not relevant, we can do that. And also configure remediation to run automatically. Now, what if I want to customize one of the rules and be specific to my environment? How does that work? DOM 9 comes with a rule builder that allows you to build custom checks in your environment, and that reminds me of a let's see why. So let's take, for example, the encryption of S3 buckets. Let's say I want to write this rule on my own using my customization capabilities. So we can sign into Dom9 and select our rule builder in the compliance and governance module. So rule builder comes with a lot of services that we support, and from this list you can start writing your query. So to me, it's just putting a Lego blocks all together and ask about security settings of the service you are interested in. So we will start with S3 bucket. We'll select the action we want to check for. So our S3 bucket should have their different properties. So I'm talking about encryption, and it's here. We will select the encryption. We can also see it here in the object model. And our S3 bucket should have encryption server-side rules. That is our rule, and now we can test it on the account we selected. So we are getting the results immediately, and we can see that there are many failures, and now we can, again, view more details about the failure. We can enable auto remediation with cloud bots, or we can apply exclusion. Now, customizations are important because some of the checks would need to be applied on specific regions, or maybe we need to apply them to specific tags. Sometimes we would want to check specific settings that are unique to our deployment, or just write new rules because we have a cool idea on how the security needs to work. Now, the next step after applying the exclusions, making sure that we know how to remediate our findings, would be setting it up for an ongoing process, making sure that instead of doing ad hoc assessment, as we did back in the old days, we are running it as a process that makes sense to the cloud deployments. So that is the ongoing process piece. Dashboards are also an important piece of my ongoing process because they allow me to understand where the biggest risks are, and they also make me look better in front of my management. The reports that can be sent to an email or through the APIs to whoever needs to know what's going on in my environment is also an important step in the ongoing process. Integrations. If we are running several tools, we probably want to understand how the information about same instance relates to each other. So if I have Tenable, the host level scanning capability, when I scan my instances for vulnerabilities, I would want to see that connected to my findings from the posture management in Dom9, and here is why. So the integration with Tenable allows me to get all of those vulnerabilities about the instances from Tenable to Dom9. So we start with setup. We connect the Dom9 user to Tenable with few single steps and then generate keys to be able to interconnect the systems. Now in Dom9, we put those keys in the administration. And once we finished with the setup, which was, as you saw, few copying and pasting of the credentials, we are all set. Now, Tenable findings now, after the scan is running, would be sent to Dom9. So only alerts that relate to accounts that Dom9 is monitoring will be sent. Now, if I go to a dashboard, I can quickly filter those findings from Tenable and see what's going on. This is the alerts console where I can see all of those Tenable findings coming into the DOM9 alerts view. But that's not the main reason why we need this information, not only because we want to show it. We want to look at the instances that are public and remediate Tenable findings only for those instances because we have too many alerts. And that is how we can easily do it in the rule builder. So we are building query that is instance where isPublic equals true. It should not have external findings from Tenable. So the query is human readable. You are able to understand what it says, and you can quickly identify all of those instances that are vulnerable and public, which is why integration of DOM9 and Tenable brings us to the better prioritization capability. Now, if we have other tools that help our company, for example, with ticketing process, it's important to leverage the existing tools instead of inventing the wheel. So our integration with ServiceNow helps companies to integrate the posture management findings and send them to the ServiceNow, for example. So let's see how it will work. So all of the compliance findings that were identified, for example, by Azure NIST 853 or by containers or by AWS framework that relevant to AWS would be sent to ServiceNow. Now, in ServiceNow, our teams would be able to get the information about those findings and trigger the process that makes sense to them. They can start assigning it to the category, make changes where is it in the process, or open that in DOM9 to get more details about the findings. And that makes the life of the security team a little bit easier because they don't need to switch from tool to tool with logging into each one of them. And it helps them to leverage the tools that they're familiar with. Now, there are more capabilities here that we are showing about filtering and how you can apply filters to search for tickets and find the right things you want to look at. Now, we talked about all of those steps of the posture management. And before we kind of summarize everything and how all those demos relate to each other, I wanted to show you how we can connect the incident response to the posture management and why it's important to look at them both together. So, as we saw, the posture management component of DOM9 has different rule sets, frameworks that we can monitor. There are over 40 rule sets, and we will select one of them, AWS NIST framework for cybersecurity. We can run it, as we already saw on other demos, and the results, we will filter them on the high severity finding on one of the instances. So let's find an instance with an interesting finding. And we see here that one of our instances is open to the public internet through port 22. Now I want to investigate that. So say we identify this finding and we want to see what's going on. The database instance probably holds a database. And we already saw that it is exposed to the public internet. We have more information here about all the additional attributes for this instance. And now we can also look at the traffic alerts from Logic that looks at the threat and does the analysis. Not only that, we can also see that the same instance has some guard duty findings that are coming from AWS guard duty. And with visualization, we can understand that this traffic was from malicious IP. That makes me feel very worried. So I started with the compliance rule, and now I understand that something bad is going on. I want to schedule that to run on an ongoing basis to identify more cases like that. So that is how we define the policy to run that rule set on an ongoing basis. I can schedule that to run on a schedule, depending on the need. Different types of reports can be sent. And now this will be running automatically on an ongoing basis. Now, what if I want to trigger remediation based on that? I already saw that there was some malicious traffic, and I want to constantly manage the posture of it using automation. That's where I assign a cloud bot that would go and remediate this finding for me. So I would stop an instance immediately if I see this type of finding. So I'm being cautious here, and I'm only stopping the specific instance that I saw that there was a malicious traffic. And now the cloud bot would be remediating this issue for me. Now that is why the posture management piece is so important and needs to fit into your incident response and back to the posture management. So we already saw those different capabilities that are important for the posture management, and I just want to recap and make sure that we can understand how they relate to all the demos that you saw. So posture management and inventory to understand what do you have in your cloud environment and how is that compliant with all of the requirements that I want to monitor. Visualization to understand where the biggest exposures are. And auto remediation with cloud bots that helps you to make sure that this process is automated and does not require any effort on your side. Protection capabilities, network security, and connection to the threat intelligence. Those are the main components of the good posture management. So now, Sion, you don't need to tell anyone what is that. So who remembers our memory game? Come on. Okay. So I claim that posture management is the new compliance. And not only that, I also think that it needs to be continuous and automated. And that is because in the cloud environments, the agility and constant changes lead to enormous amount of blind spots. And it's our responsibility to make sure that the cloud is protected. We need to automate and make sure that we act as developers and we don't stop them. And with that, there is time for questions. Anyone? No questions? Are you ready to implement all of that tomorrow? Come again?
We have done the POC.
Okay, cool.
And we have done the POC with Redlock as well.
Yes.
So do you have something so that you can show what are the differences and what are the best points here in comparison to
That's a very good question and a tough one. I think that I talked about customization and the simplicity on how you can write the rule and run the compliance with a few clicks type of a process, whether it's visualization, whether it's running your new query, or making the compliance process automated and continuous. So I believe that the way that the foundation of DOM9 is designed allows you to spend as less time as possible on customizing and fine-tuning the system to your needs to get meaningful results without big amount of false positives. So that is one of the biggest advantages that I'm seeing. if you want to talk a little bit more about that, I'm happy to set up a separate session and we can talk about the competitive comparison. Now, with one more thing that on top of my head is containers now and the serverless integration into .NET that allows you to run the same GSL query as you saw with Tenable. You can now do the same for findings in your code or on your Kubernetes, and the experience is seamless. So basically, your teams wouldn't need to learn new technology, or they wouldn't need to understand how is it different between containers and serverless. You would have the same across-the-board experience for any type of workload you want to protect. Anyone else? All right, so those are the different products in the CloudGuard family. There are more sessions that are running today and tomorrow. So pick the ones that you are interested in. Tomorrow I have a session about cloud bots and how they relate to the incident response. So come and join, and feel free to reach out. Thank you.